A woman in her mid-30s sits at a desk in a building on the Strand in London, a building which has no name on its exterior and whose location has been chosen precisely because it is at the intersection of several pedestrian routes and underground train stations such that people arriving at the building have multiple plausible reasons for their presence in that area. The building is one of several such locations that the intelligence services use when they need to work with classified material in an environment that is not a secure facility, registered as a secure facility with any government body. It is technically operated by a private company. It is functionally operated by the Joint Intelligence Committee. The woman is a senior analyst for a section of that committee whose specific remit is to assess the sourcing and reliability of intelligence product that has been circulated at the highest classification levels. She has been doing this work for 8 years. She is exceptionally good at it. The specific skill that 8 years of this work has given her is the ability to look at a piece of intelligence assessment, particularly assessment of the kind that circulates above the visibility of normal institutional scrutiny, and to notice when something about its sourcing does not quite fit the pattern it is supposed to fit. When the disruption intelligence reached her desk, it arrived not as a raw piece of collection, but as a reference in a larger assessment that had been produced by a multi-service intelligence working group focused on network disruption and degradation. The assessment concerned the operational status of a specific terrorist network active in the Middle East and North Africa. The network had been tracked and assessed by the joint intelligence process for over 4 years. The disruption being assessed concerned a sudden and unexplained degradation of the network's operational tempo in a specific country, a degradation that had been observed in the obscuring the specific chain of reasoning that had produced the conclusion. She was, in other words, trained to be suspicious of intelligence that was obviously important, and that was being handled in a way that suggested someone important was very interested in the way the truth was being shaped and distributed. When she had flagged the sourcing irregularity, she had not expected that flagging it would cause any significant disruption. She had expected that the matter would be examined by the appropriate authorities, and that she would be told that the sourcing irregularity was explained by some compartmented operation or some bilateral arrangement that her level of clearance did not permit her to be informed about. She had expected that her flag would be processed and filed, and that her file would note that she was diligent and attentive to detail. She had expected to move on to the next assessment on her desk and to continue her work at the level of precision that her career had been built on. What she had not expected was that the response would be so swift, so clearly signaling institutional awareness of what had happened, and so definitively closing off any avenue for further inquiry. The swift response and the definitive closure meant one of two things. Either the operation was extremely recent and the institutional anxiety about discovery was correspondingly high, or the operation was the culmination of a longer process that the institutions had been managing carefully, and that the appearance of the sourcing irregularity at the level where Ashford worked represented a moment of institutional vulnerability that needed to be managed rapidly to prevent the irregularity from spreading. Ashford suspected the second interpretation. She suspected it because she understood that the people who worked at the level of the Director of Special Forces did not move rapidly without cause. She suspected it because the response to her flag had involved multiple levels of institutional hierarchy in a way that suggested a contingency plan had been activated. She suspected it because the specific instruction to refer future queries to the Director of Special Forces meant that the Director was prepared to take personal institutional responsibility for what had happened, which meant that what had happened was significant enough to justify that personal responsibility. Catherine Ashford sat at her desk and drank her coffee and reread the sourcing irregularity and understood that what she was reading was the evidence of an operation conducted in a sovereign country, say targeting an individual whose presence in that country and whose activities there had been assessed as a threat to British national security, conducted without ministerial authorization, conducted without the knowledge of the Cabinet or the National Security Council, conducted under a chain of authority that did not technically include any member of the elected government. She understood that the operation had been assessed at some level of the institutional hierarchy as being more necessary than it was illegal. She understood that this assessment had been made not by accident but as a deliberate institutional calculation. She understood that the calculation had been communicated in silence to everyone involved, and that everyone involved had made their own decision to participate in it based on the institutional signal that the calculation had produced. She understood that her flag had been received as a moment of institutional vulnerability, because the vulnerabilities that she had uncovered, if they had been allowed to spread into the normal intelligence assessment machinery, would have required explanation at the political level. An explanation at the political level would have required denial or acceptance of responsibility, neither of which was what the institutions preferred. She understood that by flagging the irregularity at the level she had inadvertently triggered a process that had begun with her flag and that had ended with the Director of Special Forces deciding that taking direct institutional responsibility for the operation was less costly than allowing the irregularity to continue to circulate. This understanding did not trouble her. She was an intelligence analyst. She worked in a system in which the gap between what could be said officially and what needed to be done practically had always existed. She worked in a system in which men in positions of authority had always been called upon to make decisions about that gap. She worked in a system in which the decisions that had been made had, by and large, protected the United Kingdom from threats that the normal machinery of authorized institutional action could not have countered. She understood her role in the system. Her role was to see what was happening, to understand what it meant, and to be silent about it unless silence would result in institutional damage. She had fulfilled her role. She had flagged the irregularity. The institution had responded. The operation had been protected. The normal work of protecting national security could continue. The woman who understood what had happened and who would spend the next 7 days sitting at her desk, processing intelligence assessments and flagging sourcing issues, and preparing briefing materials for people at higher classification levels, was not troubled. She was, in fact, satisfied in a way that her job did not normally afford. Her job was normally to notice problems. Her job normally involved alerting people to disruptions in the normal intelligence machinery. Her job normally involved opening questions that other people at higher levels had to close. In this case, she had noticed a problem, and the institution had closed it rapidly and comprehensively. The operation had not been exposed. The sourcing irregularity had been contained. The relationship between the Director of Special Forces and the Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, which depended on the ability to conduct operations in the space where political authority could not reach, had been protected. The system had worked. The system had worked in Catherine Ashford's assessment exactly as it was designed to work. The system was designed to allow men in positions of operational and intelligence authority to make decisions about threats that the political machinery could not quickly enough respond to. The system was designed to do that while maintaining the institutional appearance that all action had been authorized through the appropriate channels. The system was designed to contain the knowledge of those decisions within the smallest possible number of minds, so that the political level would never be forced to choose between publicly denying what had happened and publicly accepting responsibility for it. The system was working. Catherine Ashford continued to do her job. She processed the next assessment on her desk. It was an analysis of financial flows through correspondent banking channels supporting a different network in a different region. The assessment had been flagged by the automated systems that monitored sourcing patterns for irregularities. Ashford began to read. The operation that Catherine Ashford had discovered evidence of, and that the institutional machinery had protected with remarkable speed and comprehensiveness, had been planned and executed over a period of 6 weeks. The planning had been conducted at a location that was not a military base. The planning had been conducted at a location that was technically a private consulting firm's office suite in a city that was not London. The consulting firm did not, in any official registry, have any relationship to the British government. The consulting firm did, in every practical sense, exist precisely to host planning sessions for operations that the British government wanted to plan in locations where they could not easily be discovered and where the presence of unusual numbers of people coming and going would not be remarkable. The planning cell that convened in that office suite represented 4 nationalities. It represented 2 separate intelligence services that were willing to contribute intelligence support to the operation. It represented 1 special forces unit that had been specifically chosen because of its experience in the exact type of operation that was being planned. The man who ran the planning cell was a senior officer from the Secret Intelligence Service. The man who represented the Special Forces element was a major in the SAS. The major had conducted 17 previous operations in 4 different theaters. 13 of those operations had occurred in countries where Britain officially had no military presence. The major's specific value to this planning cell was not that he had more experience than other officers the regiment could have provided. His specific value was that he was the person who had developed the most coherent doctrine for how operations could be conducted in denied environments, without leaving the kind of evidence trail that would have been discovered through the normal diplomatic and intelligence liaison channels that the host country would have available. The major was, in the specific sense that mattered, the expert in operating in the space where political authority could not reach. The team that the major brought with him for the operation itself was selected from the SAS rank structure with specific criteria in mind. The first criterion was that each member of the team needed to have demonstrated, over multiple deployments, the ability to make decisions under extreme pressure without requiring the support of a command hierarchy. The second criterion was that each member of the team needed to have sufficient experience that they would understand, without being explicitly told, that the operation they were being tasked with was being conducted in a space where official authorization was at best ambiguous and at worst completely absent. The third criterion was that each member of the team needed to be the kind of operator who would be willing to proceed with the operation under those circumstances. These are not requirements that are commonly written into selection criteria for special forces operations. They are, however, requirements that every special forces unit in the world understands at a practical level when operations are being conducted in the kinds of environments that the SAS operates in. The team that was assembled consisted of 4 operators. The team leader was a sergeant who had spent 10 years in the regiment. The assault team members were a corporal who had been in the regiment for 6 years and a private soldier who had been in the regiment for 3 years. The support team member was a lance corporal who had been in the regiment for 5 years and who had been seconded to signals intelligence roles in 2 previous operations. The team that these men formed represented approximately 60 years of cumulative experience in special forces operations across theaters, in which the political and legal frameworks for military action were at best contested. The team understood, at the deepest professional level, what they were being asked to do. The team understood that they were being asked to conduct an operation in a sovereign country, targeting an individual whose threat to national security had been assessed at the highest levels of the intelligence process, with intelligence support from a partner service, with the knowledge and approval of the Director of Special Forces, without the knowledge of the political level of the British government. The team understood that if the operation was discovered, the diplomatic and political consequences would be severe and would likely extend to consequences for the individuals involved in the planning and authorization of the operation. The team understood that the operation was being conducted because the threat had been assessed as too significant to be managed through the normal channels of authorized action and diplomacy. The team understood that they were, in fact, being asked to do the thing that special forces units exist to do, to operate in the spaces where the normal machinery of government cannot function, with the knowledge and approval of men in positions of institutional authority. So, without the knowledge or approval of the men in positions of political authority. The team, in other words, understood what the operation actually was, and the team proceeded. The intelligence picture that the planning cell was working from had been built over 37 months by 4 separate intelligence services. The picture was exceptionally complete. The target was a logistics coordinator for a network that had been assessed as responsible for attacks killing coalition personnel at a rate that had been climbing for 18 months. The target's specific role was to manage the movement of weapons and money and people across border crossings and through secure routes that the network had established through corruption and through relationships built over years of operation. The target's removal had been assessed by all 4 intelligence services as likely to degrade the network's operational capacity by 60 to 70% for a minimum of 18 months. The network did not have a second person who could do what the target did. The relationships that the target had built could not be replicated quickly. The trust that the target had earned with corrupt officials and with members of the network's support structure could not be transferred to a successor. The target was not, therefore, a replaceable position in the network. The target was a bottleneck. And the bottleneck was the target's specific vulnerability and the target's specific value to the operation that was being planned. The target's location had been identified through a combination of signals, intelligence collection, and human source reporting. The target was living in a residential compound in a city in the country where the operation was going to be conducted. The compound was secure but not militarily fortified. It had a perimeter wall. It had a guarded gate. It had multiple entry and exit points. It was, from a tactical perspective, an environment in which a skilled 4-man team could gain entry, neutralize the target, and extract within a time frame that was measured in minutes rather than hours. The pattern of life intelligence suggested that the target spent a specific period of time Approximately 3 hours in the early morning before dawn, in a portion of the compound that was less heavily guarded and where the presence of additional security personnel was minimized. The intelligence assessment indicated that the target slept during this period in a specific room of the compound. The assessment indicated that there was typically one armed guard present, sometimes two, but never more than two. The intelligence assessment indicated that the target himself, while he maintained a handgun within reach, did not typically sleep with his weapon immediately to hand. The intelligence assessment indicated that the target's security protocols were, in the specific sense that mattered for this operation, at their least permeable during the window between 0200 hours and 0300 hours. The planning cell, working from this intelligence picture, designed an operation that was calibrated to exploit exactly that window. The operation was briefed to the Director of Special Forces in a meeting that took place in a secure room at his residence at a time that this account will not specify. The director was shown the intelligence picture. The director was shown the tactical plan. The director was shown the assessment that the operation had been reviewed and approved by the intelligence officer who was providing liaison to the planning cell, who was a man with authority to make such approvals within his specific remit. The director was shown the assessment that the diplomatic consequences of a discovered operation would be significant but not, in the judgment of the experienced intelligence officer who had assessed them, say likely to include a complete rupture of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the host country, because the host country itself had been allowing the network to operate within its borders for reasons that the host country's government understood as damaging to the nation's stability. The director was shown the assessment that the intelligence yield from the operation would likely be exceptional given the target's position within the network. The director made a decision. The decision took him approximately 40 seconds from the moment the briefing concluded. The decision was yes. The decision, like most decisions of this nature and at this level of the intelligence hierarchy, was not documented. The decision was communicated verbally to the man who had briefed him. The man who had briefed him carried the decision back to the planning cell. The planning cell, understanding that the decision had been made, began final preparations for the operation. The final preparations took 5 days. The team flew into the region on commercial flights using cover identities that had been established years earlier through liaison with the partner service. The team's weapons and equipment were provided in country by the partner service, which had cached them in 3 separate locations that had been established before the team's arrival. The team's communications equipment was provided by the partner service. The team's vehicles, which were civilian vehicles of the type that would not attract attention in the country, were provided by the partner service. The intelligence support for the operation, the signals intelligence collection that would track the target's movements, the technical surveillance that would monitor the security presence around the compound, was provided by the partner service and by a signals intelligence unit from the British side that had been embedded with the partner service's technical capabilities. The safe houses from which the team would operate before and after the direct action phase were provided by the partner service. The safe house from which the assault element would stage immediately prior to the operation was a house that was rented by individuals who had no connection to any government. It was a house that had been selected because it was in a part of the city where foreigners coming and going would not be remarkable. It was a house that had been secured by the partner services station in the country. The house contained only the equipment and supplies that the team would require for the operation itself. Nothing in the house would connect it to any government. Everything in the house could be explained as the personal possessions of private citizens. The team's plan for the operation was memorized. No written orders were generated. The only copies of the operational plan were the ones that existed in the heads of the men who would execute it and the ones that existed in encrypted form in the communication systems of the 2 intelligence services that were supporting the operation. The operation was executed at 0200 hours on a morning whose specific date this account will not include. The team moved from the safe house to a position approximately 500 meters from the target's compound. The movement took 40 minutes. The team was in civilian dress. The team was unarmed at this stage of the operation. The weapons were cached at a staging point that the team had identified during the 2-day reconnaissance phase that preceded the operation. The team reached the staging point without being observed. The weapons were retrieved. The team moved from the staging point to a position at the perimeter of the target's compound, a movement that took approximately 15 minutes. The movement was conducted in darkness. The movement was conducted with the precision that the team's training and experience had given them. The team reached the perimeter at 0228 hours, approximately 12 minutes ahead of the planned approach. The early arrival allowed the team to conduct a final verification that the security posture around the compound remained consistent with the intelligence assessment. The security posture was consistent. The guard at the gate was where the intelligence assessment said he would be. The secondary guard patrol, which conducted an irregular circuit of the compound perimeter, was not present, which meant the patrol had not yet arrived on its cycle. The window remained open. At 02:35 hours, the team moved to breach point. The breach was conducted using a hydraulic spreading tool that defeated the lock mechanism on the gate without producing noise that would have been audible to personnel inside the compound. The breach took 7 seconds. The gate opened inward. The team flowed through in a formation that had been rehearsed over 2 days in a facility that the partner service had located. The formation placed the team leader and the assault element member forward, with the support element member and the second assault element member covering the rear and the entry point. The team moved through the compound in the directions that the compound layout, as understood from imagery, indicated would provide cover and concealment from the main residence. The team reached the entry point to the residence at 02:39 hours. The entry was conducted using a hydraulic ram that was applied to the lock mechanism of the outer door. The ram was applied with force calculated to defeat the lock without producing noise that would alert personnel inside the residence. The lock was defeated. The door opened. The team entered. The entry team leader and the first assault element member moved upward through the residence to the location where the target was assessed to be sleeping. The support element member and the second assault element member secured the ground floor and the entry point. The target was in the location the intelligence assessment had predicted. The target was asleep. There was one armed guard present, positioned on a mattress in the corridor outside the target's room. The guard was asleep. The entry to the target's room was accomplished by moving past the sleeping guard, which was accomplished in the time it took the entry team leader to move from the staircase landing to the target's doorway. Approximately 3 seconds. The target woke. The target understood, in the moment he woke, that his assessment of the protection that his location provided had been wrong. The target did not reach for his weapon. The target did not resist. The target was restrained and identified and moved downward to the extraction point. The armed guard in the corridor had, in the moment when the entry team leader passed him, opened his eyes. The guard did not reach for his weapon. The guard did not resist. The guard was restrained and secured at the extraction point. The team exited the compound at 02:43 hours. The team reached the vehicles at 02:45 hours. The vehicles moved from the operational area at 02:46 hours. The vehicles were out of the city at 03:20 hours. The target was across the border of the country at 06:15 hours. The operation had been completed within the 90-minute window that the planning cell had calculated as the time required to allow the team to extract before security forces in the country could coordinate a response. No security alarm had been raised during the operation. No external personnel had been present who might have reported the presence of foreign personnel on the compound. No evidence had been left that would connect the operation to any foreign government. The operation was, from the perspective of the men who had conducted it, a technical success. The operation was, from the perspective of the intelligence services that had supported it, a technical success. The operation had produced a prisoner, and the prisoner had been assessed, in the hours following extraction, as having knowledge that would be of significant value to the intelligence services that were seeking to disrupt the network that he had served. The operation had, in other words, been exactly what the planning cell had designed it to be, and the operation had occurred in a country where Britain officially had no military presence, with no authorization from any member of the elected government, without the knowledge of the Cabinet or the National Security Council, with the approval only of men in positions of operational and intelligence authority who had calculated that the operation was more necessary than it was illegal. Catherine Ashford did not know these details. Catherine Ashford did not need to know these details. Or did Catherine Ashford knew what she needed to know, which was that the operation had occurred, that it had been successful, that it had been authorized at a level of institutional authority high enough to justify the approval, and that the operation would remain classified and compartmented in such a way that the political level of the British government would never be forced to choose between publicly acknowledging what had happened and publicly denying it. Catherine Ashford's role in the events that followed the operation was not to conduct the operation or to authorize it or to execute it. Catherine Ashford's role was simply to notice that something about the intelligence that had been generated by the operation did not fit the expected sourcing patterns. Catherine Ashford's role was to notice that irregularity and to flag it at the appropriate level. Catherine Ashford fulfilled her role. The institution responded by protecting what she had discovered. The institution did this by moving rapidly to contain the knowledge of the irregularity within the smallest possible number of minds. The institution did this by instructing Catherine Ashford to refer any future queries about the matter to the Director of Special Forces, which meant that the Director of Special Forces had taken personal institutional responsibility for the operation. The institution did this by moving forward with the understanding that the operation had been successful, the intelligence yield had been exceptional, and no diplomatic consequences had emerged because the host country understood in its own way that the presence of the network had been damaging to its stability, and that the removal of the network's logistics coordinator had accomplished something that the host country's own security services could not have accomplished. The operation a question: what do we do when the elected government's mandate is insufficient and the threat will not wait for the proper procedure to authorize a response? The answer to that question was that there are men with the authority to close that gap. The answer to that question was that those men would close it. The answer to that question was that the elected government would not ask them to explain themselves. The answer to that question was that Catherine Ashford would sit at her desk and understand what had happened, and would maintain the silence that was necessary to allow the machinery to continue to function. The answer to that question was the operation itself, conducted in a country where Britain officially had no presence, authorized at a level that did not include any minister or member of the cabinet, with the approval only of men whose mandate was understood to extend into the spaces where the elected government's mandate ended. Whitehall did not know. Whitehall did not need to know. Whitehall could, as a result, maintain the position that Britain operated only within the legal and diplomatic frameworks that the elected government maintained. Whitehall could maintain that position because the institutions had separated themselves from that position, had created the machinery that allowed operations to occur in the spaces where that position could not be maintained, and had created the machinery of silence that protected the separation. In the final accounting, the operation was a success. The network was disrupted. The intelligence yield was exceptional. The political consequences, because they were managed in silence, did not materialize. And Catherine Ashford sat at her desk and drank her coffee and understood that the gap between what Whitehall needed and what Whitehall could authorize had been closed in exactly the way that Whitehall would always close it in the future, without ever having to officially acknowledge that the gap had been closed at all.